The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, was formed on February 1st in 1960. It began from 4 black college students at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College. They all sat at the white lunch counter together, and when there was no retaliation, the students recruited 30 more students that day to join them the next day. This attracted the attention of reporters, and the day after, over 60 places at the lunch counter were filled with sit-in protesters. The manager had to close the store after it continued to escalate. Although this stopped the protest, it inspired others in 5 cities in North Carolina. By the end of the month, every southern state was involved with sit-ins, with over 50,000 students participating. This event became known as the Greensboro Sit-in. The SNCC was officially formed after the sit-ins became popular to organize. Ella Baker from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, held a conference to establish goals and share knowledge. This conference led to the creation of the SNCC. The Freedom Rides were activists who rode buses through the segregated southern U.S. states to challenge the legality and enforcement of segregated buses after the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. The South ignored the ruling and often responded violently. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, encouraged and sponsored most of them, but the SNCC was also involved in organizing some of them. The Voter Education Project raised money and distributed it to the civil rights organizations to educate their members about the importance and impact of voting. Many people were reluctant to vote because white citizen councils, political leaders, and the KKK used arrest, terrorism, and threats to prevent black people from voting. Over 200,000 Americans organized for a political rally known as the March on Washington. This rally became well known for the I Have a Dream speech Martin Luther King Jr. gave. SNCC leader John Lewis also spoke here, but not of how far the civil rights movement had come. He spoke of what still needed to be done and what people should expect of society to be satisfied. In 1964, CORE and the SNCC organized a voting registration drive called Freedom Summer. The white community responded to this more aggressively than anything that had happened so far. 3 people were murdered who supported the movement. In 1962, only 7% of eligible blacks registered to vote in Mississippi. White political leaders knew if eligible blacks all registered to vote, their political power would increase exponentially.
The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, also known as the MFDP, was one of the many organizations during the 1960s which were attempting to get an African American voice into the government. They were founded in 1964 by those affiliated with the Council of Federal Organizations in the months before what was known as Freedom Summer. Their goal was to get African Americans into the voting booth as well as obtain seats at the Democratic National Convention. The MFDP was a part of the civil rights movement and fought for the voting rights of all people of color. The MFDP faced many struggles in the time that it was active. The KKK was a constant threat, as well as non-affiliated white Mississippians who caused violence toward the MFDP members. An example of this is with 3 MFDP associates, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, who were arrested by authorities in Nashua County, Mississippi, and given to KKK members who later beat and killed them. Chaney, Goodman, Schwerner's attackers were allowed to walk free, many of them getting no jail time at all, and none of them getting more than 6 years. Along with physical threats, the MFDP faced political blocks put in place by white Democrats who wanted to keep the MFDP from obtaining seats at the DNC. Through all this adversity, the MFDP were able to obtain 2 non-voting seats at the Democratic National Convention, which they courageously declined as they were not full voting seats. The MFDP continued to protest the DNC, and although they never got their full seats, they paved the way for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which tore down barriers which prevented people of color from voting. thus accomplishing their original goal of getting more African Americans into the voting booths. Although their immediate success was very limited, their long term success speaks for itself, as they paved the way for a voting act and contributed greatly to the civil rights movement.
The very beginning of the SCLC can be tracked back to the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott began on December 5, 1955, after Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat for a white man on the bus. The boycott lasted 381 days total and ended on December 21, 1956, with the desegregation of the Montgomery bus system. This boycott was carried out by the newly established Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA. Martin Luther King Jr. served as president and Ralph Abernathy served as program director. It was one of history's most dramatic and massive nonviolent protests, stunning the nation and the world. The boycott was also a signal to Black America to begin a new phase of the long struggle, a phase that can be known as modern civil rights movement. As bus boycotts spread through the South, leaders of the MIA and other protesters met in Atlanta on January 10th and 11th in 1957. They formed a regional organization and coordinate protests and activities across the South. Despite a bombing of the home and the church of Ralph David Abernathy during the Atlanta meeting, 60 people and 10 states assembled and announced the founding of the Southern Leadership Conference on Transportation and Nonviolent Integration. There were 5 founders who founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference: Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Joseph Lowery, Fred Shuttleworth, and Bayard Rustin. Martin Luther King Jr. served as the organization's first president from its founding until his assassination in 1968. King was succeeded by Ralph Abernathy, who served as president until 1977, and James Lowery, who served until 1997. Today, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is still active as a national and international human rights organization.
CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. CORE was founded in 1942 by an interracial group of students in Chicago. The founders were really influenced by Gandhi's teaching of nonviolent resistance. In 1961, CORE organized the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides of 1961 and the Freedom Summer Project of 1964 was CORE's most memorial contribution to the civil rights struggle. CORE volunteers were assaulted, tear gassed, and jailed, and some were killed. James Farmer survived a Ku Klux Klan murder plot. His leadership contributed to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In Birmingham, Alabama, a bus was firebombed and rioters were beaten by the Ku Klux Klan. By the end of 1961, CORE affiliated 53 chapters. CORE was strongly participated in Kennedy's voter education project and co-sponsored the 1963 March on Washington. In 1963, CORE shifted its attention to segregation in the North and the South, where 2/3 of the organization were located. Leadership in the northern chapters had become almost entirely African American. In 1964, CORE participated in the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, where 3 founders were killed. In 1966, the organization was losing members and financial support. James Farmer stepped down from being the national director and was replaced by Floyd McKissick. McKissick encouraged the term Black Power and was a more accessible leader to the African American community. CORE sit-in. On February 1st, 1960, 4 African American college students walked up to an all-white only counter at the Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina, and ordered a coffee. Their service was refused. Despite threats and intimidation, the students sat patiently and waited to be served. The 1960 students began to break down segregation of the Upper South, and lunch counters were integrated in cities like Texas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. CORE voting. African Americans in the South faced obstacles when trying to vote. Blacks risked harassment, intimidation, and physical violence when voting. In 1961, CORE joined the SCLC in nonviolent demonstrations in Georgia and Birmingham. They wanted to attract media attention and pressure the U.S. government to protect Black constitutional rights. The Voting Act of 1965 grew out of both public protest and privately political negotiation. In 1960, only 5% of eligible Blacks were registered to vote in Mississippi, and in 1968, only 60% were